that okay? So yes, I'm going to be talking about the windows around the saints around us, the amazing windows at Christ Church. And it's important right from the beginning to note that we're going to be talking about physical aspects of the church, but to realize that the building is not the church, and you all and all of those that are part of this wonderful community, we are the church, but the building is important. And so today I'm going to be providing some information and explanations about the church, about the windows, and try to point out how they point us towards God. But more importantly, what I'm going to try to provide is an invitation for all of you to join with me and learning more about them as we journey together, not just this morning, but in our life together. So with that, let's take a quick look at what our itinerary for today is going to be, just to kind of orient you. We're going to have an overview of the windows real quickly, and then I'm going to talk about the history, an interesting history of the windows of the church. Then we're going to take a closer look at several of the windows of the saints. We don't have time enough to look at all of them. There's a huge number of windows in our church, and all of them are worthy of study, but we're only going to be looking at a few of them with close-up views that we normally can't see from the floor with high-resolution photography. So maybe we can see some details that we might normally miss. So we're going to be asking ourselves, what do these windows tell us? What information is contained in them that the creators wanted us to know? And then, how do they point in this season of Epiphany to Jesus? Then I'm going to share with you some resources for learning more and for studying them, and then close with just kind of what do the windows mean? And there'll be time for some Q&A. So with that, why don't we enter the church? And because I want to orient you physically in the building, because we're not in the building. Actually, it would be kind of fun to actually be standing in the church and pointing up, but you'd need opera glasses to actually see the kinds of details probably that I'm going to be talking about. So let's just enter into the church. And when we come in off of Lake Drive, when we come into this entry area, we are normally greeted by friendly people. And that's where our attention is focused, on the friendship and the welcoming. So oftentimes we miss, and I have missed it until only recently, these two amazing windows that are just to our right as you enter into the church. The first one is this creation window, shows a Genesis 1 picture, and next to it is a Genesis 2 picture showing Adam and Eve in the garden reaching for this apple, and we all want to holler at them, don't do it, but they did it anyway. And so these windows are beautiful in their own right, but they tell us something about what we're about to experience, I believe. These are in the beginning windows that are in the beginning of our journey into the church. So I think they're telling us that as we enter into this church, we're not just entering into a building, we're entering into a story. And when we do step in, here's a familiar view of Christ Church and the interior. And we see these beautiful windows up high along both sides, these clear story windows. These are the windows that contain the saints. And these are the windows I'm going to focus upon today, even though there are many other windows in the church. But before I do, if we only look ahead here, we're missing something very important. And that is this view right behind us. So I'm going to ask us to turn around in this imaginary journey into the church building, and we look up at these tall windows that are called the Lancet Windows for their shape, and they're totally beautiful. I'm sure you've all appreciated them. They contain so much detail, it's hard to see them down from the floor. These are all that contain the stories of the parables of Jesus. There's 14 windows here, and that's about half of the parables of the New Testament that are shown in these windows. But just to show you the detail, I'm going to go in and focus on one of these windows and blow it up a little bit so you can see what we're looking at. Look at that beautiful picture. There's 14 of them like this. And this parable, I'm sure most of you can figure that out as you study it. It's kind of fun to do that. This is the parable of the day workers. And it's a story of God's grace, where this worker who has just worked 1 hour at the end of the day receives the same payment for his efforts, as did the workers who worked all day or larger parts of the day. And you can see them in the background. They're not really happy about what's going on. So that's just one of the windows that's in that wonderful set of Lancet windows at the rear of the church. But let's look back forward again to where the main action is going to take place today. These windows, maybe we don't even notice them more often when we walk into the church, but if we dim the lights, we can see them better. And now we start to see the light coming in these windows. And there's a few physical features, geometries, that I want to point out to you that I think are actually kind of important here. Notice that in the rear of the church, up to the crossing aisle, they are in groups of three. And that's an architectural requirement, as we have these ceiling beams. If you can see, I don't know if you can see my computer pointer here, that require there to be a space in between the windows. So there's groups of threes, and then up beyond the crossing aisle, there are groups of two. And I think that's important, and I'll mention that in a minute or two. Here is a map that I'm just going to dwell on that just for a moment. This comes from Martha and Jack Prince's wonderful Christ Church 75 years. And you'll hear me referring to that again. I noticed that Martha's here this morning, so I'm glad she is, and welcome. And this is a map, and you need a map. There are almost 100 stained glass windows in this church, almost 100. And we're going to be looking, as I said, these saints that comprise 46 of that 100. And here you can see, if you look up towards the front, here's Lake Drive out here at the top of the picture. Towards the bottom is the chancel and altar area. And here you can see, I've just put in to illustrate these groups of two. These are the kind of the superstars of the church, get to be up closer to the altar. The 12 apostles plus 4 other characters that we'll be looking at, and we'll be looking at a couple of them. Back beyond, in the body of the church, there are over 30 saints in the windows, and they're in these groups of 3. And as I mentioned, I want us to kind of think about, why are they grouped together in the way they are? The creators of these windows had something in mind when they did that. Out of these 30 saints, 12 of them are women, and they are grouped, interestingly enough, together. The women and the men are separated, as you can see here. So having said that, here's all of those saints together, thanks to Adobe Photoshop. Here's what all 46 of those saints' windows look like. What an amazing amount of information when you consider that each of these windows is about 8 feet tall, and as you'll see in a few minutes, contain enormous amounts of information. So just who are these people? Who are these people? Well, one of the things that's important to realize, there are members of the communion of saints that contains both the living and the dead, people who have been people of faith. But these are not perfect people, and they're not in the stained glass because they're perfect. They're up there because even though they are flawed just like us and have been redeemed by the grace of God. And there's all kinds of people in here. There's kings and queens, there are mothers and widows, and there are peasants and very wealthy people. There are soldiers, there are clergy, all kinds of types of people, and we're going to see a few of them as we move along. So given those saints, we can pray. We say this prayer and from the prayer book: Almighty God, by your Holy Spirit, you have made us one with your saints in heaven and on earth. So there's the ones that folks in the windows and us. Grant that in our earthly pilgrimage, we may always be supported by this fellowship of love and prayer. So with that, I'm going to try to focus us a little bit on some of the history of the windows before we actually start looking at the stories that are contained in them. History of the windows. I first want to point out that, again, this document that Martha and Jack Prince published in 2008 on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the church, very, very useful. I'm also indebted to conversations with Martha Prince and with Sonia Pavlik and with Pam Eversfield, and I'll mention, hopefully, I'll be able to remember and to mention where those took place. First of all, the windows were installed during the 1940s and the 1960s I'm talking about the saints' windows now. This did not happen overnight. This took about 20 years. And it was here's a picture actually from around 1941. This is taken from this Christchurch 75 years document. I think it's an amazing picture, early on construction of the church. And you can see these three windows, these groups of 3 by 3. So they were planned to be there from the very beginning. They were planned largely by Father Day, who was the first rector of Christ Church, and he was there for 24 years, from 1931 to 1955. Here's a picture of him that I took from a wonderful little biography of Father Day that was loaned to me by Meredy and Tom Scrivener. So thank you guys for that. I found that very useful. He was actually an avid bird watcher, among other things. But according to Martha Prince, he was also the son of a church architect. And apparently that implanted in him a love of church architecture and stained glass windows. So he was a driving force in getting those windows started. Now they were crafted by another man named Erhard Stettner, who lived here in Milwaukee, part of a company called the Esser Company. I don't know if they're still around or not. Erhard Stettner was considered a master craftsman, and he did windows in a lot of different churches in the Milwaukee area, but all across the upper Midwest, and from Oshkosh down to Oak Park, Illinois. And Martha tells me that she's been in a number of those churches where he did these amazing windows, but she has seen none of them, the collections that are as complete as the ones that are as the collection in Christ Church. So it's kind of amazing. He was considered a master craftsman, as I said, and evidence of that is that when there was, during the 60s, when there was a restoration of the windows, stained glass windows in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Stettner was one of the people called in to do that. So we were blessed to have a really gifted artist. And then they were sponsored by individual parishioners, and that made it possible. You can imagine the cost of those windows was probably quite significant. I'm appreciative to Pam Eversfield for providing me the information that shows we have the record still of the parishioners who made contributions to those windows. Another thing that's valuable about these windows and wonderful about them is that the fabrication was made using traditional techniques that dated back to the 13th, 14th centuries. And that was to take molten glass, and in its molten state, as it's lying flat, you mix in metal oxide particles that can give it the reds and the blues and those yellow colors that are so striking. A lot of churches, to save costs and because they don't have the artistic skills available today, have just glass that is painted, but you really lose something when you do that. So we've got these kind of original fabrication techniques. And here's a picture of just how the light comes through the windows. This is actually a picture that Mary took in our chapel. And we've all seen the light at one time or another streaming through the windows. And it comes through in this chaotic, or is it holy pattern. As a physicist, I can tell you the reason the light just doesn't transmit the image perfectly is because the way this glass is made, it's not even and not uniform, and it's not made with optical flatness being a criterion. And also those embedded particles of the metal oxides, I think, cause the light to scatter. So I can tell you that the way this light pattern works is all described by the equations of physics. On the other hand, one might ask, where did those equations of physics come from? And that's a different subject to talk about, but I'll just share one quote from Stephen Hawking, who said, those equations of physics do exist, but who was it who breathed fire into the equations to give them something to describe? So I believe that light is not just a result of physics. I think there's a holiness, and I think we've all experienced that occasionally. Then there's going to be a few surprises in these windows, and I hope probably some of them are lost to history because this is quite a while ago. But just for example, and this is something that was pointed out again in that church document. of 75 years, there's a piece of glass in one of our stained glass windows, a red glass from the Coventry Cathedral in England. Coventry Cathedral was one of the largest cathedrals in England, built in the 14th century, and it was bombed during World War II and almost totally destroyed, and everything was just in ruins. But a piece of red glass from that Coventry Cathedral was obtained and was placed in the picture in the I'm not going to show it, the glass window of St. Margaret of Scotland. So I'll leave it to you to go and study that window. There's lots of red in that window, and to see if you can figure out where that came from. So where is it located in the window? So with that, let's actually dive in and look at some windows. Here are two windows that are up close to the front of the church. In fact, these are the two windows that Scott Rydell gets to see every Sunday from his vantage point in those groups of two. This is St. Paul and St. Luke. And so I thought I'd start with a couple of pretty familiar characters to most of us and ask some questions and see what we can learn from these windows. The first question would be, why are Paul and Luke together in this collection, in the sets of 2 by 2 windows? Recall that Luke and Paul, their ministries were extended from within a year after the resurrection to probably 65 AD or so. One reason they're together is that they were both prolific writers in the New Testament. Between Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and Paul and all his letters, they wrote well over a half of the New Testament. But Luke was also a companion of Paul's through 2 of his missionary journeys and through much of the rest of his life. But let's take a look, for example, at this window of St. Paul for a second. We see Paul as holding a huge sword. Well, Paul wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a military or a combat kind of a person. So what's that about? Well, he's holding a document here that says Spiritus Gladius, which means sword of the spirit. And that reminds us of a passage from the letter to the Ephesians, where Paul is telling us about putting on the full armor of God. And a part of that, he says, take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And you might notice that the sword of the Spirit is a very big sword. Secondly, we see these 3 circles that are blue up at the top of the window, and they have little waves. And I think they are water waves. Now, I have to speculate about this, but I'm pretty sure that I'm right about this. I think those 3 circles and those waves represent Paul's 3 missionary journeys that are included in talked about in the book of Acts. And Paul, in his journeys, did a lot of navigation on the seas. And in the first century, that was quite a daring and unusual thing to do. In fact, some scholars who are not Christian scholars, but just scholars about navigation in ancient navigation, have said that the descriptions of Paul's journeys that are included in the book of Acts is some of the best historical documents on what ancient navigation was like. So that's pretty interesting. Now let's take a look at Luke's picture over here and see what we can learn here. First of all, up at the very top, we see this symbol, which is the symbol of the medical profession. Luke, we know, was a doctor. Another thing that shows here, down below, down near just above his feet, and this surprised me until I had to do some more research to try to find this out. There's an artist, a painter's palette. And what was that about? There's no mention of anything like that in the Bible, but it turns out in the historical treatments of Luke in the 2nd and 3rd century, it was claimed that he was an accomplished painter. So this tells us a little bit about Luke. The most important thing probably about Luke, though, is this feather, this quill that is coming out of his right hand, if you can see that, this quill, because Luke was probably one of the first really good reporters. He wrote in detail, in a level of detail that maybe came from a physician's mind, but a level of detail that other gospel writers probably didn't have. And in fact, at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, he says this, he says, I too decided after investigating everything carefully from the very first to write an orderly account. for you. So both Paul and Luke were good at writing things down. As I mentioned, they were partners in ministry, and they were partners to the very end. In a touching, in the final letter, it's believed to be the final letter that St. Paul wrote, the second letter to Timothy, while Paul is languishing in a Roman jail, probably awaiting execution. There's a lot of evidence to believe that's the case, awaiting execution. He's sending this letter out to Timothy, and he reports in there, he says, only Luke is with me. So Luke, the faithful companion, stayed with Paul to the very end. And so they're together in these windows. Now let's look at another set of windows. Now these are located, if you stand at the crossing aisle and look up to your left, as you're facing the altar, look up to the left, you'll see these three windows. The Justin Martyr, St. Ignatius of Antioch, and St. Stephen. What they have in common is they're all early martyrs of the Christian church. And there's a huge amount of detail in these windows to get us jump-started to do some more research to find out about just who Justin Martyr was. Notice he's got a large sword too in this book, Apologia. What is that about? And what is this ladder that may be going up into heaven or into the sky? What is that about? St. Ignatius, the most dramatic part of this picture is these big chains that he is bound in. And it looks like some Roman architecture back here. And then there are these hearts on his robe. I just want to encourage you to kind of look at those kind of things, because they're all clues that as you go and study a little bit more about these saints, they will point you into telling us something about their faith and maybe about our faith as well. But I'm more interested in talking about St. Stephen right now. So let's look at him. He is a very interesting guy. He lived in Jerusalem, and his story takes place probably within a year after the resurrection. He was the first martyr, as far as is recorded, of the Christian church. Now, he was one of the 7 men picked by the apostles to take out bread and food to the hungry people in the community. And so you see him, if you see what he's carrying in his arms, he has a loaf of bread, and that is on top of a book. And in that book, we can only guess, are the scriptures. He was greatly knowledgeable in scripture. And we know that from the book of Acts around chapter 6 and 7, where he engages the people in the streets as he's making these food distributions, telling them about Old and New Testament stories and how they all point to Jesus. And in these testimonies that he gave out on the streets, he got himself into trouble, probably on more than one occasion, but in the occasion recorded by Luke in the book of Acts, he runs into a hostile crowd and they confront him, and he preaches to them anyway. Now, and he's totally fearless. Now, it's interesting. What is this? I'm sorry. There we go. What is this garment that he is wearing? This looks like, to me, a garment called a dalmatic, which ordained deacons wear. And Stephen and the others of the early 7, because they did this outreach emphasis in their ministry, are regarded as prototypes of the first deacons of the church. Now, one of the most interesting things about this picture, most of the saints that we see in the pictures are either looking straight into the camera, you might say, or looking to the left or right. Stephen is looking up. And that is because after he gave his great long testimony about the Christian faith, he was assaulted by this crowd. And we are told in the book of Acts, it says, but filled with the Holy Spirit, Stephen, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. So that's why Stephen is looking up. And then immediately after saying these words, he was stoned to death by the crowd. And if you look down towards his knee, just below his knee and at his right foot, you can see the stones that are already heading in his direction. So that's a little bit more about Stephen. I want to talk about the resources. I promised I would say something about that and say something, a little something about how they might be used. I've already mentioned this Christchurch 75 years document. I'm told by Pam Eversfield in the office that there's still a number of those available. This not only talks about the windows, but it talks about a lot of the early history of the church and up to the year 2008. And in fact, there's even a picture there in the year 2008 of this brand new curate who's just come to the church named Seth Dietrich preaching. So that alone is worth the price of admission. So it's a wonderful document and a great labor of devotion and love by the princes. But there are some others here, and this Holy Women and Holy Men, a book which celebrates the saints that is put out by the Episcopal Church. And let me just talk to a little bit about how that might be used. Every morning, Mary and I have an app on our phone called Day by Day, which it's a free app, and it brings up the readings for the day that are appointed in the lectionary of the Episcopal Church. I just took this picture on Friday, which was when I was preparing this slide, and you can see here, there's a feast day for these saints, Agnes and Cecilia of Rome, two women. They were both martyred around 304 for Agnes and around 230 for Cecilia. So knowing that, we went back to look in the Holy Women, Holy Men book and found out a little bit more about Cecilia. So there's a lot of text here. I'm not going to read all that, but I'll point out a couple of things about her just before we look at her window. She was a betrothed to a pagan who bore the name of Valerian, it says. Cecilia's witness resulted in the conversion of Valerian and his brother Tiburtius. Because of their conversion, the brothers were martyred, and while Cecilia was burying them, she too was arrested. After several failed attempts to put her to death, she died from injuries sustained by the ordeal. What a tragic story. But then there's this. It says, she's remembered for the passion with which she sang the praises of God. And Cecilia is first depicted in Christian art as a martyr, but since the 14th century, she is often shown playing the organ, a theme picked up by the famous artist Raphael in his famous altarpiece for San Giovanni, this church in Bologna, Italy, around in the 16th century. So here's St. Cecilia's window. Again, here's three windows. These are three women, along with Cecilia, along with Perpetua and Thecla, all who are martyred in the early days of the church. So let's look at Cecilia just for a moment. And you can see, what is she carrying? She's got an organ, right? She's holding an organ in her arm, a little pipe organ. And down below her feet, we see two wreaths, the funeral wreaths that she would have been laying on the graves of her husband and her brother-in-law. And then there in front of it is this awful knife. It looks like an assassin's knife that was probably used to kill them. At the very top, here are angels lifting up the crown of righteousness with the stars in the crown, knowing that she has been lifted up into heaven. So this is just a way that the windows can enhance our daily study, even by using it with some of our study resources as we study scripture and we do our daily devotions. So there's other documents too. This book called All Saints, which is kind of a bargain because you can get it for about $15 from Amazon by Robert Ellsberg, is also a good source of information about the saints. Well, let's move on. I want to look at finally, and this is the final set of windows I'm going to talk about it today, because we just don't have time to look at all of them, but this is a very, very interesting one. If you're standing near the crossing aisle and you look up to your right, you'll see these three windows with Bishop Kemper, Bishop Seabury, and St. Augustine of Canterbury. So what do they have in common? Well, they have a lot. And in fact, they together tell an amazing story that I'm going to share with you briefly. They're all bishops. That's one thing they have in common. Seabury and Kemper are the only two Americans in the stained glass windows. And Kemper, and they're also the two most recent saints. You can see Kemper AD 1835. That's when he was consecrated as a bishop. But let's look into this story. It's a fascinating story, and we'll see what it tells us. Let's just look a little bit at Augustine first. First of all, this is not Augustine the theologian, Augustine of Hippo, who many of us have heard about. There's a window for Augustine of Hippo also in the church, but this is Augustine of Canterbury. And he was a monk, happily living his life in the late 6th century, around the year 595 or so, when Pope Gregory summons him and told him he wanted Augustine to lead an expedition into England to convert the people of England to Christianity. Well, that was a pretty formidable task because, for one thing, it was about 1,000-mile walk up over mountain passes through hostile regions. And people didn't have carbon fiber trekking poles and Vibram soles and Gore-Tex parkas in those days. That was going to be a hard expedition. Plus, what they knew is that the king who was waiting there on the southern shore of England, who was going to greet them, was a pagan who just as likely as not might kill Augustine and his party. There were about 40 people in his party. So it was pretty terrifying prospect. So in fact, Augustine and his entourage of about 40 other people took off, and about halfway into the journey, they lost their courage and they went back and told Pope Gregory that this was a bad idea, which is usually not something you want to say to a pope. And Pope Gregory says, no, I'm not going to have any of that. You go back and go fulfill your mission. And so they did. And in 597, you see AD 597, they arrived on the southern shore of England and went to Canterbury, where they were greeted by this king who, it turns out, had a Christian wife. And so they were received gratefully. And in fact, the king was excited about accepting Christianity. And in the year following Augustine's arrival, something like 10,000 people were baptized. At Canterbury is also where later on, as you can see at the very top, over the top of Augustine's mitre are the spires of Canterbury Cathedral, which of course wasn't built for another 800 or 900 years. There's also one more thing that's kind of interesting to show how valuable the Pope viewed this mission. Is down at the very low, at the bottom, but between where it says St. Augustine and where it says Canterbury, you see this vestment, this Y-shaped vestment. And then you also see that St. Augustine is wearing that vestment. That's called a pallium. And that was a new thing to me when I started studying these pictures. But the pallium is a vestment normally only worn by popes. And so the Pope sent this vestment a couple of years after Augustine's ministry there to show his great appreciation and to kind of anoint Augustine as the bishop of all of England. Now, there's a lot of history that took place there, but eventually Canterbury became the seat and almost the world capital of the Anglican Communion, which includes the Episcopal Church. So let us move then to Bishop Seabury. Oh, now one more thing I want to tell you here. There is a recent book that Mary and I read just this last year. In fact, we listened to it on audio tape. It is a riveting book. It's called A Pilgrimage to Eternity, From Canterbury to Rome in Search of a Faith. And this is by Timothy Egan, who's a New York Times reporter who'd made this trip on foot, reproducing the journey that Augustine had made, although he did it in a backwards order. And it was quite a fascinating account, and he's talking a lot about his own personal faith as he goes along. I highly recommend it. So now let's look at to Seabury just a bit. Seabury, you can see 1784, and he's an American. That should tell you something right there. This was just at the very end of the American Revolution. And the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was the church that was in the United States for the most part. And there was a problem in the church once the war was over, because the Church of England swore allegiance to the crown. And of course, that was no longer a good idea in the United States. So the new Episcopal Church was formed. And so it was a new church separate from the Church of England for the first time. And there was one problem, though, they had, and that was that they had no bishops in the US. And you need to have bishops in an Episcopal church because you need them to ordain other priests. So if the church is going to grow, you need to have more priests. And so you need to have a bishop. So the church decided to send Father Seabury to England to get him consecrated as a bishop. Well, the people in the English church weren't really happy to do this. And so they refused and they rejected Seabury's request. So Seabury went to Scotland. And of course, the Scots have always been, never miss an opportunity to stick a needle into the sides of the Brit. So the Church of Scotland ordained Bishop Seabury, and he became the first bishop of the Episcopal Church. And so the church got a good start in this new country. You can see up at the top whereas Augustine had the Canterbury Cathedral at the top, you see a building like an old colonial church. If you go to Boston today and you look at some of those old colonial churches, they look a lot like that building that's at the top of this picture. Now, something else began to happen about this time in the Episcopal Church that affected the church, and that was the great westward migration in the United States. And people were moving and populating the western states. And the Episcopal Church wanted to send priests to start new churches and missionaries out into the West. But very few, and this is not just my opinion, this is kind of what the church historians will say, the Episcopal Church in general was slow to get started in that direction because most of the priests were happy to stay in their little libraries by the fireplace sipping sherry on a winter afternoon back in Virginia or North Carolina, and didn't really want to go out to where there were snakes and wild animals and hostile people who might greet them. So this brings us to Jackson Kemper. And there's a very interesting story about him. He became the first missionary bishop of the Episcopal Church, and he was appointed or consecrated as the bishop, first missionary bishop in 1835, and he headed out in this era where we are talking about reunification of the three dioceses in Wisconsin. Some people have said, gosh, a diocese of all of Wisconsin seems like that would be unmanageably large. Well, Kemper was appointed as the bishop of the so-called Northwest Territory, the whole Northwest. And you can even see these pine trees along the borders of the window here, indicating the forested windows of the Northwest. He was the bishop of what was today Indiana, Missouri, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Nebraska. So that was quite an assignment he had. However, it wasn't that hard because there weren't any churches. So Kemper went out and he planted over 100 churches, in this region. That is amazing, including churches, a lot of churches in Wisconsin. The first Episcopal church in Milwaukee was planted, started by Jackson Kemper, and that's St. Paul's. And so he brought the church here. Now, another problem that they had, as soon as they were having all of these churches built, there weren't enough clergy to fill them. So he started Nashotah House, the seminary just a half hour to the west of us here. And so amazing contribution. Now there's some other things you'll notice in this picture of Kemper. One is, if you look down here, there is I'll blow it up a little bit. There is an Indian tomahawk that he's holding in his right hand. And Kemper, one of the things that was noteworthy about him was his care for interacting and reaching out to the Native American tribes in northern Wisconsin, and he did that. He became the first bishop of Wisconsin in 1859. So the first bishop of Wisconsin was Jackson Kemper. Let's take another little look at him close up by his face here. How you can zoom in and just see the amazing detail in his in these pictures. And notice even, for example, the trim around his mitre here, how 3D it looks, and what great work that Stettner did as an artist. Now, Kemper is the most modern of the saints in our windows. And in fact, he lived in the age of photography. So we can actually compare the accuracy of Stetner's artwork with actual photographs that exist of Kemper. Here's a photograph that I found on the internet in about 5 minutes, but I can imagine it wasn't very easy to find that photograph back in the 1940s. But notice, for example, the sideburns here on Kemper, the curls in the back of his hair, the kind of harsh angle of his eyebrows. Amazing, amazing detail. Also notice the old primitive frontier kind of church. We've gone from Canterbury Cathedral to the colonial churches to the frontier churches in the frontier that Kemper founded. It reminds me of the church that I first served up in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, when Mary and I first moved back to Wisconsin from the sunny Southwest. You know, I was raised in Los Angeles. I was kind of a fair weather boy and was serving a large Episcopal church in El Paso, Texas, when we received a call to come to central Wisconsin. We wanted to do that to be close to Mary's mom, who was ill. And so we made that move, and we arrived at the beginning of winter. And here I am, imagine this West Texas guy, and I arrive here, and 2 weeks later, it's 14 below zero. So I was having some questions about, like, is this the smartest thing you could have done, Jim? But then I thought about Jackson Kemper. And this was a Kemper church, the Church of the Intercession in Stevens Point, one of those 100 churches that he founded. And I could just hear his voice saying, Jim, I founded this church for the glory of God. Now, what are you going to do? And that kind of turned me around. Anyway, I said that there was a big story here, and it is a huge story, because if you followed this rather long description, what we have seen is no less than the story of how the Episcopal Church in Wisconsin traces its roots all the way back to Rome. That's pretty astounding. Oh, there's one more saint I want to talk about this morning before we close, and that is Saint Oswald. We've kind of got to talk about Saint Oswald. And if you stand in the back of near the back of the church and look up to your right, you can see Oswald. And I've already dimmed these other, bring them back up, of St. George and St. Louis. What these three guys have in common is you can see that they're dressed in armor with shields and weapons. These were all soldiers, and they were daring, bold soldiers. Oswald was a soldier, but also a political leader. And in the years after Augustine arrived, probably around 650 AD, he was in charge of over half of Eastern England. So he was a very powerful man, but he was also a man of great faith, and he was known for his kindness. And he was much beloved by the people, much beloved by the people. In fact, there was even a talk about creating a Church of Oswald at one point in the early days in England. So Oswald was a man of great courage and great faith, much like our Oswald. Let's go back and wrap up here. I'm going to close now, but I just want to say a couple of things, two final thoughts about these saints that are in these windows up above here. Today's church and the work of Christ in the world is not being done by those people in the windows. It's being done by the people who fill these seats below from week to week. I sort of see it as a football field. And I know there's some folks here who probably don't want to talk about football today, but this is how I see it. The work of the church, the work of Christ in the world is done by these people, you and me. But we are being cheered on by the folks up in the stadium here, up in the seats, these saints from the years past. And they're looking down on us, and they're part of this communion of saints that we are part of too. And they're encouraging us. When maybe we're feeling a little discouraged, maybe Saint Cecilia will pull out her organ and sing us a song of praise to cheer us up. When we're feeling our courage lapsing, maybe Oswald will look down upon us and say, come on, guys, you can do this. Maybe when we're uncertain about the future direction of the church, we'll hear Jackson Kemper speak to us and say, look, guys, I built this church for the glory of God. Now, what are you going to do? And so I think this, I went the wrong way here, I'm sorry. This passage from the letter to the Hebrews kind of sums it up. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us, and those witnesses are the saints, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. There's one more thing, and it's summarized here in this other wonderful window that I hadn't mentioned yet. But if you come into the front of the church in the opening entry doors, and not walk into the main part of the church, but make a hard left turn like you're heading to the stairway that goes down to the columbarium, there on your left is this amazing window showing a guardian angel holding Christ Church. It's a beautiful picture, and it reminds us that God holds us, as our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, would tell us, holds us in his almighty hands. And so I'm going to conclude my talk there, and we can take questions if there are questions or comments. I'm going to try to end the screen share and okay. Are there any questions? I haven't looked at the chat.
Okay, Jim, that was incredible and really amazing. People are clapping here. I don't know if you can hear it or not. And we had quite a few people end up filling in. We've got about 10 people here. If it's okay with you and those at home, I'm just going to read a couple of these questions. It'll just be easier for me than typing them in. Okay, first, is there a photo gallery of the windows on the Christ Church website? Also the map and the history.
As far as I know, there isn't, but you know, that could be done now. I have the photos of all the saints windows, not all of the windows, but I have those, and the map can be reproduced. It's in that 75th anniversary document that the princes put together.
Yeah, that would be great. We should actually do that. Good job. And then also,
Seth, let me just interrupt. Jim took all these pictures. He's so humble. He's been taking pictures for months to get them just at the right angle. So these photographs are all taken by Jim.
really spectacular. How did, just on that note, Jim, did you climb up like a pretty tall ladder?
I scaled the walls of the church. No, I wish I were able to do that. But what I did is I got as far across as I could to the opposite wall from the window. I shot upward with a mild telephoto lens, and then I used the perspective corrections in Adobe Photoshop to make them to eliminate the perspective distortion. That works really well, as you can see.
Yeah, really quite remarkable. And then this same person asked, is there a narrative description of each of the windows that could be accessed on the website, or just generally? Jack and Martha's book is so amazing, especially in the way that it gives some of the history and it gives that map.
Right.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but much of this that you presented today was your own original research around each of the
Right.
kind of contents of the window, right?
Yes, for the most part. I mean, some of the things like the red glass from Coventry Cathedral, that was with Jack and Martha's uncovering. They published that in that 75th document. But for most of I've just, I studied it. So there are these resources you can look at. I should add that also, and this is kind of almost embarrassing, but Wikipedia oftentimes has some remarkable descriptions of the saints. That's why I said at the beginning, this is as much an invitation as it was the passing on of some information, because I think there's a lot of work to do to look at some of these other saints and what does it mean, and there's a lot of stories there.
You've got, here, I'll do one more of these questions, and then I see there's a question in the chat. This person asks, how might we create a multi-generational study guide for the Windows? So, which I think is a great idea. Someone obviously has nominated you to take that on as like a part 2 of the project. More applause here.
Well, there is a part 2 that actually is starting soon. As soon as we can get together, King has invited me to come in and talk to the kids about the stained glass windows. So I'll be trying to put together something that they can enjoy, and it'll be interesting to hear their ideas of what they think, where they think this should go. So yeah, I think that is something that involves every one of us in the church. Here's a couple. Gretchen Holder asked in the chat, she says, is it difficult to maintain them? Has a strong wind ever put them at risk? I think and I don't know the answer to that question, but it worries me a little bit too. They're irreplaceable, valuable, beautiful works of art. And I suspect they're pretty strong, but maybe somebody else knows more about that than I do. Greg, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, on the outside of the windows, there is protective glass. So they're just not exposed to the elements themselves, but there is protective glass outside of the windows.
Great, and that protects them against possible vandalism as well. So yeah, great. That's good to know. Maggie Dietrich says Isaiah could do a GoPro tour on a ladder. Well, that might be fun. That might be a tremendous idea. And then Gretchen Holder added, or on a platform like Michelangelo's. Now we're getting creative. Are there other questions? I see John Hayden and then Chell. John, you're on mute. John, you're muted.
Okay, got it?
Yes.
My question relates to the composition of each of those pictures. Are they copied from someplace else, or did this artist dream up all of those, create all of those scenes? I mean, the detail, for example, one person couldn't possibly, it seems to me, know so much as to create all those windows. Were they copied from someplace else?
Now, Martha Prince would know more about that than I do, and I see she's with us today. I don't know if she wants to chime in on that, but she might have comments to make about that, and that she would know more than I do. But I thought, as I've looked at these things, that Father Day and Erhard Stettner must have had a lot of fun sitting around dreaming these windows up. Or if they had more help, I'm not sure, but I suspect that they did look at windows or pictures of windows from especially the European cathedrals where the great stained glass is located. So that's a good question. I didn't give you a definitive answer, but I suspect they did look at other windows. Chell?
Okay, yeah, I don't have a question, but I want to say that one of the great privileges of singing in choir is sitting there and looking directly up at those stained glass windows. I mean, the light shines through them and the sides of the windows just take on those colors. It's a huge rainbow. It's like an explosion of color.
Yes.
And when you look at them, some of the colors are put together in a certain way. It gives it almost a three-dimensional effect when I'm looking at it. And you just can't help but feel that you're involved in all of this. I mean, it's a very, very, I don't know how to explain it, but it just draws you in to the feeling that you are surrounded with a lot of people who have sacrificed a lot to get us to where we are. I mean, it's just a very humbling experience.
I would say that was a very articulate summary of the whole purpose of the windows. That was beautifully said, Chell. Do we have other questions or comments?
I'd add, oh, John, please.
John, again. And I think Mary might have had a.
Well, if I just might say, would you think about doing the windows in the chapel? Because they are terrific and they're eye level. So we can
Yes.
really see them rather than looking up. I think a program on the chapel windows would be terrific.
Totally be interested in doing that at some point. Absolutely. Those are beautiful windows in there. You're right. And we can see them up close. And I encourage you to do like I've done, is to actually go up to those windows and touch them. And there you can feel the pieces of metal that are intertwined in between the individual pieces of glass. And it makes the artistry accomplishment even more impressive when you get up close to them like that. Yeah.
Okay, this is Martha Prince, and
Hi,
I
Martha.
have felt a long time that our art community should be made aware of these windows, because to me, they are something that should be known by the art people. They talk a lot about, for instance, the Tiffany windows at St. Paul's, which are a totally different kind of very marvelous windows, but I think our windows ought to be, I hope somebody knows how to get through to some of the people, maybe at the art museum or something, that would make them more well-known.
Well, thank you, Martha. And you've just heard an invitation put out to all of us gathered here. And I don't quite know how to personally do that, but maybe there's one of you who knows someone or has an idea of how to do that. I totally agree with what Martha just said. Thank you.
This is Bob.
Yes.
I think it was about a year ago, I was at a meeting at Christ Church, and Father Seth was in attendance, and we were talking about saints in the Episcopal Church. And I knew that there were saints. I just didn't know how the process worked. Is there anyone in our lifespan that is considered a saint and has been identified as a saint? Seth, could you remind us about some of the things that you mentioned?
I think you're muted, Seth.
Sure. I was just messing with my trying to unblur my background so you guys could see who's here, and I did not succeed at that. So I don't know that I heard your whole question, Bob, but I think you were asking, does the Episcopal Church continue to incorporate saints into their sort of catalog of saints?
Yes, and how does that happen? And are there some contemporary saints who are have just recently passed, or, well, what is it about the process for becoming a saint in the Episcopal Church?
Well, and I invite Mary and Jim and Bishop Ed to chime in too. I don't know the details of the process. I assume that there is a body of people who report to General Convention, the triennial gathering of delegates from all over the Episcopal Church. And I imagine that this body is sorting through suggestions for people to be added to the catalog, Holy Men and Women, or Lesser Feasts and Fasts. And they are definitely continuing to look at new people. When I did this presentation on Pauli Murray, I talked about how in 2018, Pauli Murray was added to Holy Men and Holy Women, as was Thurgood Marshall, who was a parishioner at St. Philip's in Harlem. He was actually an Episcopalian. And so you don't have to be an Episcopalian, but he was, so was Pauli. But yeah, it's an ongoing process, and sort of what you have to do to qualify, all of those things. I don't know if does anyone else have insights into that, lay or ordained among us?
Yeah, I certainly don't know. I don't think there are, to become a Catholic saint, there are some very tight prescriptions on what you must do, including miracles and things like that. But I don't think in the Episcopal Church there is. But I wouldn't have anything to say, add to what Seth just said, which was really good.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
I hear Ed Lydell.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there is a process and there's a committee usually set up by General Convention that makes reports every year. So there is a constant process about particular people and their place in the communion of saints and in our calendar and so on and so forth. So it does exist.
Thank you.
There's also a wonderful book by our own John Julian, who recently died.
Yes.
He was my confessor, and later on in life, I was his confessor. A wonderful person. But it's called Stars in a Dark World, Stories of the Saints and Holy Days of the Liturgy. It's a very thick book with like 1,000 or so pages, but it's a wonderful anthology of all the saints of the church with a wonderful description, a whole full-page description of each of the saints.
Nice. Thank you.
I just wanted to maybe say one more thing, and I think then we are going to let people go, I think. But just building on a couple different comments about the beauty of the windows, the ways that the light streams through. I encourage you, as the church year goes through, our liturgical calendar, of course, is overlaid with the seasonal calendar. And as the sun tracks in different ways across the sky, even at the same time of day, 10 a.m., that sun will hit different windows in different ways. So I encourage you to pay attention to it during worship, but then also a number of people make use of a quiet, dark church during the week. And some of the most beautiful times to see those windows are at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a winter day, when the sun is positioned in a way that has an even more direct impact through some of those clear story windows. So I imagine, Jim, when you were taking some of those photos, you were doing that at different times of the day. Some of those were in the afternoon. And so the church is wide open to any of you. You're all members here. So, use the combination 3514 on the Beaumont door, 3514, and then let yourself in and just simply pray in a pew and take in the beauty there, in a way that is almost sort of like a little retreat. The space is open to you. I just want to make that point.
Yeah, thank you, Seth. I want to say during this project, I was a number of times would be in the church with the lights off by myself, and it is a very special experience. I encourage you all to experience it.
Well, thank you. I learned so much, Jim, and I've been among these windows for 14 and a half years. So I'm so grateful. I know I speak for all of us when I say, the amount of knowledge and your research and the way that you gave it to us in these gorgeous images, just so appreciated. So, so thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Yeah. All right. You all take care. Blessings.
Thank you. Bye-bye.